Hello and welcome to the first of 10 webinars by Search for Common Ground on countering violent extremism. In this first webinar, we'll explore what this curriculum is about and delve into the main concepts of countering violent extremism. Now, the field of countering violent extremism is rapidly growing and changing as we learn from practice and from research. However, these rapid changes have made it difficult for practitioners in government and civil society roles to really understand the latest good practices and lessons learned in countering violent extremism. Therefore, this curriculum is designed to provide training for these actors on the field. It's structured into 10 learning modules and is accompanied by training materials including a facilitator's guide, slide presentations, and handouts to allow for multi-day trainings on its content. They include a series of activities for each module and links to illustrative videos that provide primers for discussion and reflection. Now, each module also includes additional resources for more in-depth learning, as well as some guiding questions to help you decide on how to incorporate them into your own work. This curriculum really highlights the benefits of collaborative approaches beyond the use of military or securitized responses to violent extremism. It draws on good practices and offers tools and guidance for easy adaptation into your own local context. Finally, it encourages the early identification and mitigation of risks with programming, as well as ensuring a do-no-harm approach. This training curriculum is available in the link below in the description. Now, this training was produced by Search for Common Ground in collaboration with Hedaya and generously financed by the European Union under the Strive Global Program. So whenever we begin this conversation on countering violent extremism, we're always asked what we mean by these complex terms such as violent extremism and terrorism. So how would you define it? How would you define them? The reality is that there's really no mutually shared definition of these terms, and the way that we define them can actually affect the way that we work on addressing these problems. Even when a definition is clear, applying that violent extremist label to groups or individuals can be done in ways that are oftentimes biased or subjective. In other times, these terms can even be politicized. Therefore, we really have to be sensitive and really thoughtful about how we define them. So when we refer to countering violent extremism, we mean it as an umbrella term to refer to the programs and policies which aim to dissuade individuals or groups from radicalization and recruitment into violent extremism and resorting to ideologically motivated violence to further social, economic, religiously based, or political objectives. But what does countering violent extremism really look like in practice? Look at this chart here, which was produced by Hedaya, called the Countering Violent Extremism Cycle. It's a map or framework that indicates the ideal responses for each stage of the radicalization process. It's based on the assumption that there are specific countering violent extremism responses for each different stage of a person's level of engagement with violent extremism. In that way, these responses can help a person stop their own radicalization process or to return back to the desired state, that is, to be with the rest of their community. Therefore, you will see green arrows on the chart that signify countering violent extremism activities that are best targeted to those people in that level of involvement that can redirect their views and approaches to be more in line with those of the general population of their community. Now, of course, the so-called radicalization process is not really linear, and a person's involvement in violent extremism does not always follow this path. Some steps may, for example, be skipped altogether, or sometimes a person may pull back on their own before deciding later to pursue a violent extremist group or ideology. In the next module, we will explore the reasons why a person might become involved in violent extremism and the factors that can drive that interest. Now, through our increasing understanding of what drives radicalization in a person, we are able to design responses to counter those factors according to an individual's specific situation, and hence the need for individual needs assessments throughout the process of engaging with them as part of countering violent extremism programming. Now, the countering violent extremism cycle suggests a series of responses. Let's look at them in turn. The first, general prevention, targets the general population where radicalization is not necessarily occurring in order to disable the existing factors that could possibly drive radicalization, or responses that build the community's awareness of the issue or their resilience to it. Specific prevention responses focus on specific groups or individuals who have demonstrated some vulnerability to the issue of radicalization. And these responses work to help the individuals overcome them or to be more resilient to the appeal of violent extremism. Now, when someone has begun the radicalization process, such as by exhibiting certain beliefs or behaviors, or by becoming associated with extremist individuals or groups, early intervention is needed. It is important to note here that early intervention responses are in the pre-criminal space, in that the person may not have committed a crime motivated by violent extremism. Instead, the responses here are meant to quickly intervene in a person's radicalization process that might be beginning in order to prevent that from happening. So these responses should really be seen as providing help and guidance rather than, say, catching violent extremists. However, once a person has actually embraced a violent extremism ideology or joined a violent extremist group, for example, different responses are now necessary. So instead of responses to prevent or stop the radicalization process, now responses must guide that individual back to the general population through a series of sequential activities. Therefore, you'll see that the green arrow on the right side of the screen is now longer, as it requires the individual to go through these steps before circling back and returning to the state of the general population. Of course, these steps will need to be customized according to that person's individual needs assessment, right? So this process begins with disengagement and or de-radicalization, which are responses to get the individual to stop participating with a violent extremist group and to have a new worldview that is not radicalized. Next, rehabilitation responses aim to restore the cognitive and behavioral norms of a person to help them prepare themselves for reintegration and to deal with issues that they might face. Rehabilitation might also mean dealing with trauma that they've experienced, whether it was a reason for their radicalization in the first place or perhaps as a result of their engagement with a violent extremist group. Finally, reintegration responses target those who are trying to reconcile with their communities. So there is a need to work with both the former violent extremist as well as with the community. So in this way, we can help the individual adjust to a normal life and be accepted by the community in some way. This is really about reducing the risk of their return, as well as to help prevent the individual from radicalizing again, especially due to continued or increased marginalization because of these things that they've done. Now, this is a very brief explanation of this, but it serves to give you an overview of what countering violent extremism looks like in theory and in practice. Now, this is related to counterterrorism, but it's very different. This is because counterterrorism is in the realm of coercive or non-coercive policies and programs that prevent and deny opportunities for violent extremist activity. These are also things that disrupt, arrest, prosecute, and even kill violent extremist groups and individuals. These traditional, coercive, and sometimes forceful counterterrorism measures are usually limited to government actors, such as the security forces or the military, but they can include other institutions. For example, with anti-terrorist financing, where you try to stop and identify and freeze the assets of violent extremist groups in order to stop their raising and use of funds. So in those cases, sometimes banking institutions, for example, are enlisted to help in that cause. But really, counterterrorism is in the realm of security forces like police and the military. But when we hear that term, countering violent extremism, there's often a lot of distrust in some of these communities that we want to work with, especially because of its relationship and its perceived relationship with counterterrorism. Sometimes the concerns about countering violent extremism can be valid, and sometimes they can also just be based on perceptions that perhaps are misconstrued in some way. For example, countering violent extremism has been criticized for marginalizing the target communities we want to work with. It's been accused of instrumentalizing them instead of enlisting them to solve their own issues and problems and the grievances that they really face. The field's been accused of securitizing other important efforts like social cohesion, peace building, or development. It's also been criticized, and sometimes appropriately, for having a difficulty in measuring success in what works in the field, although we've made many strides to really improve the way we monitor and evaluate our programming. And finally, countering violent extremism has been criticized of simply masquerading other fields and programs as countering violent extremism. For example, that means a particular development or educational or let's say even an employment program that's just simply labeled as countering violent extremism based on certain assumptions that they would have the kinds of impact that would reduce the threat to violent extremism. Now, sometimes these criticisms are valid, and sometimes they're based on perceptions. For these reasons, countering violent extremism as a field of practice is a sensitive field. All of these things are important, and in fact, it's best that we avoid the kinds of issues that we have here, and we do that by employing a do no harm approach. When we say a do no harm approach, we mean that it's an approach that is the practice of understanding how countering violent extremism efforts interact with local dynamics and relationships in ways that allow practitioners to mitigate or avoid negative, unintended consequences that may result from these efforts and to focus on positively influencing these dynamics and relationships. Now, through these webinars, we will share with you videos from around the world on countering violent extremism programming. In this video, the first one, which you can access by clicking on the picture on your screen, is about the Countering Violent Extremism program in Los Angeles, which was one of 3 American cities that piloted this field. Now, when you click on the link on your screen, watch the video for the kinds of challenges that they faced and how they overcame them. After watching the video, we just wanted to wrap up this discussion with a few key takeaways on countering violent extremism. First, violent extremism is a complex problem, but we don't like to use the word phenomenon or say that it is somehow impossible to understand or address because we really have come a long way on understanding the process of radicalization or addressing the drivers of violent extremism in a particular area or context. Preventing and countering violent extremism requires a broad approach with multiple tools, as you saw in the video. Violent extremism is also a context-specific issue, and it really can't be associated with any particular religious, ethnic, or national group. As you saw in the video, they really tried to address multiple forms of violent extremism, such as white supremacy and so forth. Next, how we define violent extremism in other terms is really important, as we discussed earlier in this webinar. Next, countering violent extremism really requires the involvement of a whole society, which is again something we saw in the video. Finally, as we saw in the example from the video of the suspicious action reporting system, there may actually be costs to failure when our countering violent extremism programs do not work or when they do not approach the issue sensitively. Therefore, over the next 9 webinars, we will discuss the ways to build a whole-of-society approach in addressing the issue of violent extremism in a particular context. We will look at tools and best practices and lessons learned on how to avoid these kinds of issues and on how to employ a whole-of-society approach for those within our communities so that they can really be partners in countering violent extremism. Thank you.